What's up, painters? Welcome back to Bellamars Miniatures. Today I'm working on the jungle bases that I'm using for my Votann army. Intro over, let's get to it. The first step is Vallejo Earth Texture. I'm using a plastic knife to smear this all over the bases. I'm putting it on pretty thickly and I'm not looking for it to be smooth at all. The goal is for it to look like muddy jungle flooring, so some grooves and crevices are exactly what we want here. I'm doing the 5 bases for my Hearthguard, which I painted in my very first video. If you haven't seen it, you should go check it out. And 3 bases for my Thunderkin, which there'll be a video for sometime in the next few weeks. I still haven't quite finished painting them, so they're not ready to go yet. Once I've got a nice thick layer of the earth texture and I'm happy with how it's looking, I move on to the rocks. These rocks are nothing fancy. In fact, I stole them from my mate's gravel driveway. Don't tell him that. Let's just keep that as our little secret. I clean them all with some warm soapy water, then rinse them to make sure there was no soap on them. Then once they dry, they're just perfect for our bases. The first step is working out how I want the rocks sitting on the bases. I prefer to work that out before starting to push them into the texture. It'd be a pain to realise I don't like how they sit after I've displaced the earth texture, and then I'd have to fix it all. I put some PVA glue on the rock and then just gently push it into the earth texture. Then I come in with a rubber brush tool and just push the earth texture around, make sure there are no gaps and none of the PVA glue is still showing. When the glue dries, it'll show a very different texture that will be obvious and stand out, and that's something I don't want. Some of the bases get one large rock, others get a couple of smaller rocks. It's all about variety and making each base look different. In the interest of variety, I also don't put rocks on all the bases. I just pick a few bases to put the rocks on. In this case, I put them on 5 of the 8 bases I'm working on. Once I'm happy with the rocks, I move on to the next feature, which are the logs or fallen trees. These are just some dead sticks and twigs that I stole from my mate's garden. Yeah, it's the same mate. I should hope he doesn't watch this video or he'll never leave me unsupervised in his yard again. I follow the same steps as I did for the rocks. I decide where they're going, apply some glue, then push the earth texture around till I'm happy with how it's all sitting. Again, I'm only putting these on a few bases. For the sticks, I ended up choosing 4 bases, 2 that have rocks and 2 that don't, and that leaves 1 base without either rocks or sticks, so that base will get a bit of extra attention in later steps. I then left the bases to sit overnight to let the earth texture and glue dry. You really don't need to let them sit overnight, but I'd give them at least a couple hours. Then in the morning I just undercoated them all with Beastie Brown Rattlecan from Vallejo. Now it's time for some paint. I come in with Cygor Brown Contrast and lay down a layer over the whole base. I do avoid the rocks and sticks, but I'm not being too careful about it. The shiny finish that contrast paint often gives works in my favour here. It'll help give the earth a wet look and sell the money ground effect that I'm going for. Once the contrast paint is dry, it's time for some dry brushing. First, I come in with Oak Brown from Army Painter. I do this dry brush all over. I don't have to be too careful of hitting the rocks and sticks, because they're getting painted later anyway. The second layer of dry brush is a very light layer of Monster Brown. I'm just trying to pick up the raised parts that would dry out faster if it were really muddy ground, and just pick out a bit of the texture here. Next I'm doing a dry brush of a 50-50 mix of Barbarian Flesh and Monster Brown. This dry brush I'm only applying to select spots. I'm just picking out some random places to look like they're more dried out and just give a bit more variety to the bases. The final dry brush colour I'll be applying is Greenskin. I'm mostly looking to put this in places I think mould would likely grow. So near the base of the rocks or the logs, shadowy spots where you'd expect some mould. This gives a nice splash of colour and just helps break up the browns a bit. Now that the muddy ground's done, it's time to work on the rocks. I start with uniform grey and just block all the rocks in. You want to pay extra attention when doing this step. I've noticed that sometimes the paint doesn't always get into all the nooks and crannies that you get on rocks like these, so I just double check and make sure I've got good coverage and haven't missed any of the little spots. There are two options you could use for the wash on the rocks. If you're looking for a dirtier look, you could go with strong tone or any other brownish wash. I feel like there are already a lot of brown tones on these bases, so I use dark wash. This will give them a bit of a cleaner look, but I can fix that up with being a bit messier with dry brush layers later on. While I wait for the wash on the rocks to dry, I move on to the logs. I start with Monster Brown and just block that all in. This next step's really a personal preference thing, but I come in with Desert Yellow and I'm just hitting the broken ends of the logs. Most of the time in nature, the broken ends of logs and sticks are a lighter colour than the rest of the log. It's a minor detail, but it only takes a few minutes and I think it's worth it. Then I just hit the logs with a quick wash of soft tone from Army Painter. And since I've got to wait for the wash to dry on the logs, I move back to the rocks. I do a pretty heavy dry brush of uniform grey to bring back that mid-tone that we're going for. Then it's on to a lighter dry brush of ash grey. I'm focusing on the edges and the raised parts with this. It's only meant to be a light dry brush to really pick out those highlights. And then it's on to the last painting step for a while, and it's another dry brush. This time we're going back to the logs and just doing a quick dry brush of Desert Yellow. I'm just going back and forth across the logs, looking to gain some highlights and just give some definition. Now I'm done with the painting for a while and I move on to adding some more features. For the next step, I'm making a mix of PVA glue and water. The mix is around 2 parts water to 1 part PVA glue. You don't need to be precise, I just eyeballed it. I mix it up well with one of my cheap brushes that I've picked up along the way. Once I'm happy with the glue's consistency, I use the same brush to spread it on select spots on the base. Then I sprinkle on my ground cover mix, which is just a mix of dried herbs. I'm sure you'll all be relieved to know that I did not steal these from my mate. Though if he were checking his pantry right now, I wouldn't blame him. I just walked down the herb aisle of the supermarket when I was doing my shopping and picked up a few different herb packets that I thought would look good when I mixed them all together. All I'm doing is spreading the glue onto spots where I think it'll look good. Often this is up against one of the other features, as if the wind has pushed them up against it. Then I sprinkle some of the herbs on and just pat them down. Later, once the glue is dried, I'll come back and brush off any that are loose. Once again, I'm not adding this to all the bases. 5 of the bases ended up with some of the ground debris on them, and 3 didn't. After the ground debris, I move on to adding some grass tufts. These are just Army Painter tufts that I picked up from my local game store. I have 4 different types and I just pick randomly what tufts I want to use for each base. I end up picking 6 bases for grass tufts, though one of those bases did get 2. It's all about that variety. Finally, it's the last and most important step of any bases, painting the rims black. And here are some pictures of the finished bases, and some of my Votan on them. I really like these bases for my Votan. My Votan paint scheme is on the brighter side, so I either wanted darker bases or something really bright like snow. In the end I settled on these jungle bases and I'm happy I did. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching my video, and I hope it helps in your hobby adventures. If you'd like to follow my YouTube journey and see more from me, hit that subscribe button. That's all for now. See you in the next video.